Hey there, today I'm gonna show you some painting ideas that are almost as satisfying as the fluffy fur of this cat. Are you a good boy? For this first page here, I'm using my Uhuhu marker sketchbook. This one is bleed proof with alcohol markers, and I'm also gonna use the Uhuhu alcohol markers. But to be honest, you can recreate this with literally anything, any type of marker, pen, paper. Honestly, the idea is doable with all types of supplies. So here I just divided my page into these little stripes, and then I stuck with one type of color per stripe. And also the stripes that I did aren't perfectly even. You could measure that out and make them perfectly even, but I didn't really bother with that. This was just really fun and also super satisfying. I started with green and then I moved on to blue tones, like light blue tones that are sort of in the green tinted family. You could say I have a little bit of turquoise in there. And then I did some purple for the next one. And you can do any type of doodles. You really don't have to overthink this. I did some lines, I did some dots, I did some triangles, and I just switched the color every now and then and rotated between, I think I used between 3 to 5 colors per stripe and just varied those a little bit. And because we are sticking mostly with the same color family per stripe, it's still gonna look really nice and clean and cohesive, even though we're using a large variety of colors. And I'm also kind of going in rainbow order as well. So here the next stripe is a pink tone, and everything's gonna look really nice next to each other this way. And this was just really fun because it's one of those drawing ideas where you really can just relax. You could put on an audiobook or something, or just some relaxing music. Or I also like to draw stuff like that more in a meditative way where I'll just let my thoughts run and just try to focus on the art and not distract myself with anything, if that makes sense. So that could also be an exercise for that. Here, it really doesn't matter if this is gonna be a masterpiece or not. I think it's gonna look satisfying either way because we have this rainbow gradient and it's just gonna look nice next to each other, but it really doesn't have to look any certain way, and it just can come into existence naturally, basically. So just whatever comes to your mind, just draw that. And then afterwards, we erase the pencil marks, and then we have this super satisfying art piece. And just for funsies, this is what that would look like if it was framed and hung up. For this next one here, I'm starting out with a compass and I'm creating some circles. You could also use a variety of round objects, but honestly, it's easiest if you own a compass or anything that is comparable to that. And I just did a few circles, like half circles and the quarter of a circle. And then I did something similar to the first idea, but now I'm using watercolors instead. And for each section, I'm sticking mainly to very similar colors. And I'm also kind of going in a rainbow order, not as much as with the last idea. This can just flow naturally. You could do only pastel colors or only cool colors, only warm colors. Or like I did here, I used a big variety of colors, which can be a little bit harder to make that work. If you're using a lot of colors, sometimes that can look a little bit overwhelming. So just go with your intuition, and if it is too much, you can always try again. Some people like things that are really, really eclectic and have a lot of colors. Whereas I have a friend, she only likes beige, so her version of this would be only beige and maybe brown tones if it's a good day. So, whichever colors make you feel happy and give you joy are the ones you should use here. And again, I'm doing a variety of shapes. I'm doing some lines and just half circles, and then these very wiggly and weird shapes that I'm doing here on this section. It honestly doesn't matter as much as long as you try to stay within the sketch of the circles for the most part. Then it's gonna look somewhat tidy and it's not gonna look completely messy. You could obviously do this without any sketches as well and do a very similar thing, but this is just gonna give it a little bit more structure. And if you're someone who is a little bit timid about doing more abstract type of art and it doesn't usually turn out the way you want and then it stresses you out, then you could try something like this instead, because this is gonna give you a little bit of a structure, and it's almost a little bit like a coloring page where you already have some guides and you're just coloring within them, but you're still being very creative because you're making up all of these shapes. So this could really be something that is super relaxing. Try to not overthink it. I went outside of the lines a few times, but it's not the end of the world. The lines will be erased afterwards anyway, so nobody will know where they even were. So they're just little guides, and I stuck to them for the most part. But if you color outside the lines here and there, really don't fret over it too much. Here I also added a few more lines with my ruler, and I unfortunately also smudged my paint with that a little bit because it wasn't fully dry yet. So if something like that happens, that's not the end of the world either. I'll try to fix that a little bit afterwards with some white paint markers. But I'm also doing all kinds of doodles within those lines that I added here. So here you can see we have our circular shapes, and then we have those lines here in between. That's just to make it a little bit more dynamic and a little bit more interesting. And you could vary those shapes however you want. You could add lines and circles and then color within those shapes. I think that this is something that both beginner artists and more advanced artists who just want to chill and do something fun can do and really enjoy. This is something that you could really do as more of a spiritual or meditative practice, where you don't have to think about the end result as much. You just think about the one shape that you're coloring in right now. I've been doing a lot more meditation recently and yoga. I've started to try Om chanting and do that regularly. And you literally try to only think about the next Om and just focus on that. At least that's what my practice is right now. And here you just focus on the one shape that you have right now. And then after that, you focus on the next shape. So you literally go one step at a time, and that can be really relaxing. And it can also be a good practice for your brain, because that is really hard sometimes, because we do tend to think about the next step a lot. At least I do. And so I'm trying to learn to not always do that. And I also added a few doodles with my white pen. You can do that if you want. And this is what that page looks like now that it's finished. And this is what that page would look like if it was framed. So now for the next page, we're doing something very simple and abstract again. This one, you could argue, is even more simple than the last one, which makes it both easier and harder to do, because sometimes we don't want to allow ourselves to do something like this, and you could really hear your brain, at least I can sometimes hear my brain, trying to rebel and tell me, what's the point of this? Why are we doing this? Why are we literally just doing lines in different colors? And that is personally what I'm learning now. It's my ego coming up and telling me, okay, I want something to show for the time that I spent and the art that I created, but I'm not really focusing on the process itself. So if you find yourself struggling with that sometimes, where you get so worried about the end result, but you don't really focus on the painting process, then something like that could be a really good practice. And it doesn't have to turn into a masterpiece, it could just be a practice. I also added some doodles here, so I used some fine liners and just added a little bit of fun. And this was really, really fun for me. I did that to some of the shapes, not all of them, and just varied those little doodles. And I think that makes this page look really joyful. And so here is this finished page and also next to the other one. Now for our next idea, I'm using my Uhuhu Mixed Media sketchbook again, and I'm using some tape. So this is the first piece that is not completely abstract. We have a watercolor background here, and I just did a bit of a very, very loose gradient here. This isn't watercolor paper, so it's not going to turn into a perfect watercolor background, but the paper can somewhat handle that water. So now I am using my tempera sticks on top of that. If you don't own tempera sticks, you could also use oil pastels, chalk pastels, maybe even crayons or something that is opaque on top of the background. And I painted just some leaves, some branches basically on top of that, and just built up some layers here. And the tempera sticks are really hard to control. They're really, really soft. I would argue they're probably harder to control than even oil pastels. What I like about them is, first of all, they make me really playful because they're so hard to control, so I don't obsess over details as much. And second of all, they dry, so they're perfect for sketchbooks. So here I'm now removing the tape already, and I also cleaned up that border a little bit. And then this page is already finished, and it is simple, but I really like the look of it. And this is what that page would look like if it was framed. So now for the next one, here I am using my Hahnemühle gray toned sketchbook, and these are literally just doodles that I came up with on the go. These are little vases with very simple plants in them. So this is something that you could do if you're a complete beginner, and it really doesn't matter how precise you are with this. I used some colors that I already had on the other side. You can see now I switched to crayons. These are the Neo Color 2, so these are water soluble crayons. And you can use any combination of materials. I started with watercolors, then I used the crayons. Anything that you have at home and want to use is fine for this. And I played around with that a little bit. I wanted to add a little bit of pattern to the vases, and I used the crayons for that, but then I ended up not liking that, so I went over that with some water, and now that vase is green, and it's not the color that I intended it to be, but you can see that you can sort of fix your mistakes with the water soluble crayons. And it's okay. It is just a little bit of a doodly play, and we have a much more refined picture on the right side. So I didn't really want to overbear this page spread anyways. And so I just doodling this basically. I used some turquoise and even blue tones for those plants. I wanted to really play with the colors here and use some color schemes that I don't usually use. So something like that could be something where you just explore. And if you have a sketchbook that maybe isn't as precious to you, you could do a lot of these and just play around with different color combinations and figure out what you like. I realized doing this that I really like this orange and turquoise combination. I think that looks really nice and there's a nice amount of contrast. And I just added a little bit of shading, a little bit of details here and there. And I don't know if this is my favorite art piece, but it's definitely something super easy where you can just play around with it. Check out my free coloring pages on my website, and if you'd like to see some more satisfying painting ideas, then check out this video next.